Hey everybody, welcome to Introduction to Revelation. My name is Carl Santos. I'm one of the pastors at New City Church in Calgary. You probably know me if you're seeing this. If you don't, that's okay. But I'm going to be walking us through an introduction to the book of Revelation. Now, this video is meant to be a companion, almost an intro, to not just the book of Revelation, but to the series that we'll be preaching through the book of Revelation at New City Church. So I'll be as quick and concise as I can be today. I'm filming it at home. There is a lot going on. I think we're having a dishwasher replaced upstairs, so there might be some noise, but bear with me and let's jump into this incredible book of Revelation. Now, Revelation is a book that is terribly misunderstood, terribly neglected amongst the church and the world in general. And with good reason to an extent, because it is weird. It is hard to understand. In fact, since the beginning of the church, really, the book of Revelation has been puzzling and been misunderstood. Consider what some great thinkers have thought about this book. Martin Luther, the great reformer, said this: "I can in no way detect that the Holy Spirit produced it. Christ is neither taught nor known in it." Martin Luther wasn't a big fan of Revelation. Nietzsche, who is a famous atheist, of course, and philosopher, said it's the most rabid outburst of vindictiveness in all recorded history. Novelist and writer D.H. Lawrence says it's a grandiose scheme for wiping out and annihilating everybody who wasn't of the elect. The book had in it none of the real Christ and none of the real gospel. D.H. Lawrence was not a fan. George Bernard Shaw, also a skeptic and playwright, says it's a curious record of the visions of a drug addict. Jack Sanders, who is a New Testament scholar, says it's a retreat from ethical responsibility, such that its existence and place in the canon are, in the fullest sense of the word, evil. From a New Testament scholar. Tina Pippin, who's a scholar, a New Testament scholar, and a feminist, says it's a misogynist male fantasy about the end of time. John Dominic Crossan, another very well-known New Testament scholar, says it transforms the non-violent resistance of the slaughtered Jesus into the violent warfare of the slaughtering Jesus. It's been misunderstood. It's been hated, despised, rejected. And of course, it's also the place where all sorts of wild theories come up. And to me, to be honest, I find that far more off-putting when Christians come out with wild theories about what the book is about. I find it so ugly, so off-putting in general. One scholar writes that it is the happy hunting ground for all sorts of bizarre and dangerous interpretations. It's been used to predict elections, to vilify leaders and people we don't like. It's been used to predict disasters, the end of the world, technology, microchips. The way we interpret it has been, in a nutshell, irresponsible. In fact, Michael J. Gorman, another scholar, New Testament scholar, wrote a book on Revelation specifically, says that with respect to Revelation, it must be clearly stated that some readings are not only inferior to others, they are in fact unchristian and unhealthy. Now, we in general in modern Western world, certainly in Canada, don't like to be divisive. And yet we have to draw the line that there are better ways and worse ways to interpret Revelation. It is not a relative truth situation here like the rest of the world would say. Scripture, if it is Scripture, has a proper way of reading it. And although there is some boundaries, there is certainly some elasticity there to see some give and take, especially in the book of Revelation that is such a challenge to read. And yet, we do have to be very clear that there are some readings and interpretations that betray what the book says and intends so much that they must be rejected. And to an extent, that's going to happen anytime we preach through the book of Revelation. And I'm going to try my best to remain as close to the text as we can, not just to one part of the text, but to the entirety of this, not just Revelation, but all of Scripture. And as we do that, we're going to follow along the footsteps of people who are far wiser than me and you and I. We're going to walk in the footsteps of very learned men and women who have spent their lives researching this book, as well as a history of the church. We're going to try to do justice, to do what Michael Gorman calls as reading Revelation responsibly. What does it mean? Now, Christians in general do not read Revelation. It has functionally been removed from the canon, really. Pastors don't even teach it. To be honest, a lot of pastors will preach the messages to the churches in chapters 2 and 3. They may preach the new heaven and new earth in the end of the book, but they leave everything from chapter 4, or certainly from chapter 6 onwards, through to 19 out, oftentimes. And it's because I think it's difficult to preach. It's hard to know what to say when you're faced with so many illusions and images. So pastors don't preach it. And of course, by doing that, the pastors at times and lay people are guilty of what Eugene Peterson says here. He says that they avoid the demands of either imagination or intellect. If they cannot read a page with a rapid skim of an eye trained under the metronome of speed reading, they abandon the effort and slump back into passivity before cartoons and commercials. Now, that's pretty harsh for Eugene Peterson, but you see what he's saying. He's saying is the reason Christians and pastors and people in general, even skeptics who don't have a clue what Revelation says, but latch on to things like 666 or the beast, and they latch on to it so that they can tell a story or make assumptions about the Bible, they're all lazy. The fact is, Revelation requires more work. Apocalyptic literature always does. And people don't know how to do the work. Sometimes it's very honest. They just don't know how to do the work. They don't know how to understand it. Other times, they don't want to understand it. And in both cases, Peterson is saying, in one sense, they are either not willing to do the intellectual work, or they can't wrap their imaginations around it. So they just reject it or ignore it. And although that has historically been the case, let's start trying to put that right. Let's start trying to get this to be a book that people read again, certainly that we will read again and find hope in, because that's why it was written and given to the church. And the fact that we have neglected it for so long says that we are robbing ourselves of a grace, robbing ourselves of something that God has offered us. So why is it misread? Well, I think Richard Bauckham, a phenomenal scholar of the New Testament in general, but certainly his work in Revelation, tells us. He says, it's been misread so much simply because, and he thinks primarily because, we don't know what kind of a book it is. It's an interesting way of putting it. You see, I remember when I first read the book Wuthering Heights, I was under the impression it was a love story, a romance, and it is. But when people at the time said to me, read it, it's a great romance, I thought, okay, it's going to be this Victorian romance novel, which in my head, I equate with Jane Austen, tea parties, innocent misunderstandings, But when you read Wuthering Heights, it's different. It's dark. It's somber. It's a love story, but it's a tortured one. And as a result, I went in reading expecting Jane Austen, and I did not get Jane Austen. I got Heathcliff and Catherine and this struggle and this anger and frustration and hatred and violence. It was such a scratchy, earthy, organic sort of real love story that it took me a long time. In fact, I've read it a few times, and I still struggle at times to see it right because I was under the impression it was a different kind of book. And then it happened as well to me when the first time I watched a movie called Dr. Strangelove. It's an old movie from the 60s, I think it was the 60s, by Stanley Kubrick. And it's a movie that is a satire about the Cold War and the nuclear arms race and stuff like that. But of course, I didn't know it was a satire or a comedy. I just thought it was a drama. So the moment I start watching it from the beginning, I start seeing things that I want to laugh at, but I thought, am I supposed to laugh at this or not? And because I didn't know it was a satire, I didn't know how to respond or interpret what I was seeing. So it wasn't until I became very clear that this was a satire that then I could enjoy it and enter into it. And with that in mind, if you and I go into Revelation not knowing what kind of a book it is, we're going to struggle to interpret it and glean anything of value from it. And so what we're going to do in this video today as an introduction is to try to help you understand something you can't really do in sermons in the same way, is to say, what kind of a book is Revelation? And I think with this foundation, it'll start us off to reading it and to understanding it and having a fruitful engagement with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at first authorship. So we're going to talk about who wrote it and when. Then we're going to talk about what kind of a book it is. And then we'll talk about the imagery and the symbolism as well. So those three things. First thing is authorship. So to start to understand John, it would help to know who wrote it, or to understand Revelation, to understand John. So the early church was under the impression that this John was the Apostle John, John, son of Zebedee, who wrote the Gospel of John and the epistles. But although tradition says that, and many people still will say it was that John, increasingly scholars are saying it probably wasn't. And let me be very honest, it doesn't really matter who wrote it. The fact is, it's in the canon, we see it as inspired text, and it upholds and it continues the theology of the Bible as a whole, so it is part of canon. But let's look at why people think it's not John, son of Zebedee. Well, here's why. First, he doesn't mention that he's the apostle. And usually the apostles would say that. Paul, an apostle of Christ. But John doesn't say that here. John doesn't even mention that he knows Jesus at all, which oftentimes they did. They would talk about what they've seen in first-hand cases. And then when you compare the writing, and now this is something that you don't see, the older scholars didn't have textual criticism and things like that in the same way we do, where we compare writings. And if you look at John and the epistles of John, you don't see the writing style, the vocabulary, the imagery being translating into Revelation. So it looks like these are written by different people, because our writing and the way we speak are signatures. You know, if you've listened to enough of me, for instance, you're going to see there's certain things I say all the time, and certain images I draw back on, and words I fall back on. And the same way that would be the case with you writing emails to people, the way you sign off, the way you sign on, whatever. And John and Revelation, this don't seem to match. They don't seem to be from the same hand. So who is this John then? Well, here's what we do know. There was a lot of Johns who were popular in the early church era, running around the area of Asia Minor and in Rome, the Roman Empire, who were very prominent Christian leaders. So we know there was people it could have been. We also know that the book itself, in Revelation, he identifies himself as a prophet. So whoever this John is, he sees himself as a prophet. And I mean, he believes he stands in line with the Old Testament prophets. And scholars will agree that he writes in such a way that suggests that. So he's a prophet. He says he's a brother to the audience he's writing to, so he's known to the local churches in Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey. He's also talking about how he's in prison because of the word, so we know he's a witness, and that something he has done has run him afoul of the government and the authorities and has landed him in jail, in prison on Patmos, this island in the Aegean Sea. And because of all of that and the internal evidence and how it's quoted in other sources, we can date the book pretty accurately, probably to the reign of Domitian, which was from 81 to 96 AD. Most scholars will say it was near the end of that, near like 92 to 95 AD. It was written. Now, some have said, a few will still say it was earlier, from the time of Nero, which would put it between the mid-50s and 60s AD. But then others would even say it goes later to 98 to 117 AD in the time of Trajan. But the vast majority say no, it fits pretty well with what we think was going on at the time of Domitian, 81 to 96 AD. So if that's the case, here's what we do know. I mean, even at very least, we know this. Eugene Peterson, again, says, regardless of who this author is, we know this. He is God intoxicated, God possessed, and God articulate. And that, I think, he's spot on. That much we know. We know this person knows his Bible inside and out. And we'll talk about that when we get to the genres a bit. We know it was written at a time of persecution, where there was social and cultural pressure on Christians to accommodate and to conform to cultural and political norms. So we know that much as well, given what the book itself talks about. And that they're being encouraged to resist and to push back against it, but to do it in a very specific way. And we'll talk about that in the sermons. I won't get to it here. But it's a very unique way. See, we sometimes think of resisting authorities in one specific way. And usually that means violent or more aggressive forms of resistance. And I'm not saying that's not there. But everywhere in Scripture, in Revelation, we were being reminded of a certain kind of resistance. We'll talk about that in the series. But anyway, so that's what we think it was written at the end of the first century by a man named John, who saw himself as a prophet, who was well known and was a leader in the early church. Okay, and he's imprisoned because of the word. So if that's who's writing it and when, let's go into the genre. Richard Bauckham, this scholar I mentioned earlier, has a great summary line about what Revelation is. He says this: Revelation seems to be an apocalyptic prophecy in the form of a circular letter to 7 churches in the Roman province of Asia. In there, Bauckham is consolidating and uniting what is the collective wisdom of all the scholars out today, who will say Revelation is a book that encompasses 3 different genres. It is apocalypse, it is prophecy, it is letter. And those are all 3 different kinds of writing. And if you want to understand Revelation and the weird imagery and everything like that, you need to understand something of those 3 types of genres. Because if you do, understanding those 3 things, which is what we're going to do the rest of this video, will help us. It almost will work as those bumpers on a bowling alley that will keep us from getting gutter balls. It'll hold us. It'll show us, as I said earlier, there's some room to interpret things. There's some elasticity. The lane is wide. But we do want to hold from going into the gutters. And understanding these 3 types of literature will help us do that, I think, if we hold to it. So the 3 forms, the first one let's talk about is apocalypse. Now, apocalypse has a very, what does it mean today? If you say, what is an apocalypse today? Modern Canadian, even Christians would probably say things, and they'd liken it. No, Christians would liken it to the Left Behind series, Tim LaFay. But in general, people think of apocalypse, they think of destruction, the end of the world, violence, war. That's what they think about. That's what it's come to be known as. That's what Apocalypse Now, the movie, even takes that translation. But of course, the word apocalypsis in Greek doesn't have anything violent about it. It means revelation, the revealing of something. So if you understand that, then apocalypse as a revealing is what revelation is. That's what revelation means. That's where we get the word from. But apocalypse as a genre encompasses something far bigger than Revelation. You see, Revelation, when it shows up at the end of the 1st century AD, is not the first of its kind. It's not unique. One of the reasons guys like Martin Luther and others have misunderstood the genre, Revelation is because they didn't understand apocalyptic literature and the apocalyptic tradition of the Jews and of the early church. So of course, and in fact, most Christians don't. So most Christians, when they see Revelation, the reason they don't read it is weird. It's such a foreign genre to them that they don't know how to read it. And so they reject it because it seems like it's dropped out of space and into our laps. But it's not. John Collins, a great scholar, wrote a great book called, I think, The Apocalyptic Imagination, is what it's called. And he says this about summarizing what apocalypse is. And this is kind of the standard definition that scholars use. And I'll unpack it a little if it's complicated. Apocalypse is a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial insofar as it involves another supernatural world. So, we're going to talk in a minute about what he's talking about and some of the characteristics, plain and simple, about what has to be there if it's going to be an apocalypse. What characteristics? What does it look like? How do we determine that Revelation is an apocalypse, but the Gospel of John isn't? What's the difference? And we're going to talk about that. But here, let me say this as well. In the Bible, there's a lot of apocalyptic segments of Scripture. A lot of passages, a lot of chunks. The most obvious one being Daniel 7-12, which is one that the author of Revelation relies on heavily. That's an apocalyptic bit of literature. So is Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21. Isaiah 24-27 is apocalyptic in nature. Ezekiel 38 and 39. Zechariah, another book the writer of Revelation is very familiar with. Zechariah 9-14 is highly apocalyptic. And that's what's in the Bible. If we look at extra-biblical apocalyptic works, we see there's a lot of other ones too, and there's more than the ones I'm going to name. But you'll see them in books like 1st Enoch, which was written in the 3rd to 1st century BC. which is kind of the rise. The 3rd to 2nd century BC is when you see the rise of apocalyptic literature starts to really brew. And that comes because Israel, of course, is under the thumb of a foreign nation. They haven't heard from God. There hasn't been a revelation in a while. So they start writing a lot of apocalyptic literature that starts to look forward to God's returning. So Enoch 1, 2 Esdras is another one. 4 Ezra is as well. The apocalypse of Peter represents a Christian apocalypse that's not in Scripture. The Shepherd of Hermas is another one, and these were written in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. So there's a lot. In fact, I remember listening to D.A. Carson say that if it was up to him, before anybody would read Revelation, he would love to have them read 500 pages of apocalyptic literature. Because when you've read enough of these sorts of writings, you then read Revelation and see it's not as crazy as it sounds. The Revelation is being written intentionally in a style that people understood. And when you understand the style and the images that are used throughout, for instance, the imagery of horns and of thrones and of blood and colors and numbers like 7 and 12 and 11, when you start to see how those are used through all the apocalyptic literature collectively, you begin to be able to interpret Revelation quite differently and see what John is trying to say. So, what is it that makes an apocalypse an apocalypse? What are those characteristics that cause scholars to say, here are the common traits of apocalyptic literature? Well, there's 5 of them. The first one is pseudonyms. Writers of apocalyptic literature almost always write under an assumed name. So Daniel, for instance, certainly Ezra, 4 Ezra, and all the Ezras written that you'll find in some of the Apocryphas. Those books were clearly written by somebody claiming to be a historical figure. And they claim to be an historical figure because they want to lend credibility to what they're writing. And they're not trying to mislead people necessarily, but they are trying to say, hey, this gives credibility to what I'm saying, because what the apocalyptic writer is going to do is usually reinterpret history in such a way as to show them what God was doing in history to get them to this vision that they're pointing to of the end of the world or whatever. So they wrote under a pseudonym. However, John and the Revelation moves away from this tradition here. Scholars, for the most part, are unanimous in agreeing that whoever this John is, it's John. It's a guy named John. He's not writing under a pseudonym. He didn't feel a need to because he is writing as a prophet, not as a guy later writing an apocalyptic story, but he's a prophet giving an actual word from God. So this John feels no pressure to use a foreign name. So that's different, okay? So pseudonyms is the first trait. Second characteristic of apocalyptic literature is it's usually an angel-mediated message. John Collins says an otherworldly being mediates it. Usually it's an angel. And that means you have at least 3 characters in the book. You have God, who brings this message down, and he wants to get it to humanity. But he doesn't deliver it directly. He gives it to an angel who then comes and mediates it to a prophet or some seer, who then takes the message, writes it down, and gives it to the people of Israel. So that, of course, happens in Revelation. Right away, the very first verses say, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. So Revelation is in that tradition. So apocalypses have an angel-mediated message. The third thing, I don't know if you can hear all that noise. I do apologize. The third thing is a visit to heaven. Apocalypses always have the writer being spirited away to heaven. And while on this excursion to heaven, they're able to see behind the curtain, behind the scenes, and they can see, as it were, the machinations of the spirit world, almost like being taken behind the face of a watch to see the gears. And that is something, again, that happens in Revelation in chapters 4 and 5, where John is brought up into the spirit realm, into the throne room of God. So, pseudonyms, mediated message by an angel, and a visit to heaven. Those are 3. The fourth one is an overwhelming concern with the last things, the end times. Eschatology is the big theological word, the end of the world oftentimes. But here Revelation is a bit unique because although it stands in the tradition of Jewish apocalyptic literature, Jewish literature didn't often talk, at least apocalyptic literature, didn't talk about the end of the world. It didn't really crave the end of the world as much as it craved an end of empire. It didn't want dissolution of all things, but a renewal of things. It wanted, in a nutshell, the Jews wanted all the oppressive nations to be destroyed and power and glory restored to Israel as a nation. But Revelation comes and John comes and he has renewal, of course, but he sees it on a cosmic scale. The world is coming to an end. All of time and history is wrapping up like a sleeve. It's being rolled up. And that, in that way, it differs from apocalyptic literature, but it's clearly focused heavily on the end times. And another characteristic built into that end time view is all apocalypses tend to be very pessimistic on one side, but also quite optimistic. Pessimistic meaning the stories overarchingly say that the end is coming and there's nothing humanity can do to stop it. In fact, all they can do is make it worse. Humanity has no hope. So in that way, it's quite pessimistic. But it's optimistic because, especially in Revelation's case, it points to a God who cares, who has acted and will act again to deal definitively and ultimately with evil and suffering and all the problems of the world. So it's optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. Now, so if those are the four things, let me cover them again. Pseudonyms, angel mediated, visits to heaven, preoccupation with the end of the world. And then lastly is symbolism. Apocalypses are powerfully, strangely, and bizarrely symbolic. Now, these symbols are not as strange as you and I would think. Of course, today we find them strange. But if you understood and if you lived at the time of the turn of the millennia when these were written, you will find something that they rely heavily on at least three things. One, mythology. The biblical writers, John included, don't have a problem borrowing from popular and other cultures' mythology. So they'll use images about dragons and about all sorts of cosmic, strange, bizarre serpents and things like that. And you and I hesitate to say that we want to think that the Bible can't ever be quoting a myth because then it would make it a lie. No, that's not at all true. It does precisely what I do every week in sermons, which is I'm always bringing in images about books and movies and contemporary culture. And I do it because it's the way to speak to you and I. We use the images of our culture to convey truth. So apocalypses rely heavily on contemporary mythology. So it would help if you knew something and studied a little bit or could somehow get acquainted with the ancient mythologies of the ancient Near East. Not just Greek mythology, but into Babylonian and Sumerian and other culture, Phoenician, things like that. So mythology. The symbolism is also rooted in allusions. A-L-L, not I-L. Allusions meaning to the Bible. So John and all these writers know their Old Testaments brilliantly well. And part of the problem is, for you and I don't know them as well. So we don't see the obvious connections that are there to somebody who is steeped in the Old Testament, like John was, like the prophets were, like apocalyptic writers were. So it draws on mythology, the Bible, and allusions to the Bible, and then contemporary events. And we'll get to this when we get to the fact that the Revelation is a letter as well. But it draws on the context of the writer. So there are times when John is talking about Caesar. He is talking about Rome, but he's not talking exclusively about Rome. And we'll get to that in a minute. So that's the three things our symbolism is drawn in. And to understand the symbolism, you have to exercise your intellect and your imagination. You have to, or you're not going to see it right, and you're going to have all sorts of ideas about the locusts being helicopters, and the chip, the 666, and the mark of the beast being chips, microchips. I won't get into that, but let's stop. Let's say that is putting the cart far before the horse at this point. So symbolism is rooted in those three things. Now, that's what apocalypse is, okay? That's what apocalypse is, and Revelation fits into that genre. But it's not just an apocalypse. It's also a prophecy. In fact, the letter says it's a prophecy on 5 different occasions. Chapter 1, verse 3, and then all throughout chapter 22 in verse 7, 19, 18, and I don't know why I've messed up my wording here in my notes. But all through chapter 27, read it and you'll see the word prophecy mentioned, I think, 4 different times. So it tells us it's a prophecy. And then it also tells us throughout in chapter 10, verse 10, 19, verse 10, 22, verse 6 and 9, tell us that the activity of John, what he's doing in this story, is he is acting like a prophet. So it's clearly a book that is prophecy, and John intended it to be that way. We see it in his language, how he echoes Old Testament prophets. In fact, in chapters 18 and 19 of Revelation, when John is depicting and recounting the oracles against Babylon, he is echoing, not verbatim, but he's echoing every single oracle against Babylon in the Old Testament prophets. He does the same thing with talk about Tyre as well. But he sees himself as an Old Testament prophet. And because it's prophecy, here's something we need to see. The Old Testament prophets weren't out to create stargazers, people who looked at the signs to interpret them, but to comfort people and to warn and challenge people. Comfort and challenge. That's the prime, overwhelming purpose of prophecy. And if you don't believe me, take this one example. I preached through the book of Amos at New City Church recently. We know the book of Amos is primarily about Israel's lack of fidelity to God. Because they had stopped worshiping God, their practical, their everyday life, their social life had also disintegrated. Because they weren't worshiping God, they weren't loving one another and caring for the needy as well. So Amos comes and he comforts the needy and says, answers are coming, God is going to deal with it. But he also challenges the contemporary Jews and Israelites and says, you've fallen short and some of you are at danger of becoming the people who are against God. Stop it. Wake up, start obeying again, start living as if God were real. Now, if you were to come away from the book of Amos and that whole series, and even from hearing Amos if you were an ancient Jew, if you were to come away and all you got from his prophecy was, I'm going to leave here and I'm going to try to decide who it is that this nation that Amos describes is. I'm going to try to figure that out because Amos never says who the nation is that's going to come and punish Israel. If you were to come away from Amos and say, I heard what you said, Amos. You want me to figure out if this is Babylon, if this is Assyria, who it is, right? Amos would probably do the faceplant, fail move, and say, you dullard, you've missed the point. The point of the story is not to get you to figure out who the nation is, but to show you have to stop betraying God and being disobedient to God. You need to worship him, trust him, and from that position begin to love your neighbor. Transformation comes in that way, not by knowing who the nation is. And yet, isn't it amazing how often we read Revelation and we think the point of Revelation is to figure out who the beast is? And because it's a prophecy, I'm encouraging you, as you read Revelation, remember it's a prophecy. And ask the questions. When you see weird symbols, you ask the question of, how is this comforting or challenging me? Because it has to comfort and challenge not just me, but the ancient church, the church in the last 500 years, the Reformed church, the church under Napoleon, the church in the Crimean War, the church in Rwanda. It has to be relevant to all of them. And that is what prophecy is, relevant to every generation, not just yours. It is there to comfort and exhort and challenge first and foremost, not to create magicians and fortune tellers. It's not the point. Okay. Sorry to beat that so hard, but I want to be clear about that one. So it's prophecy. It's apocalypse and it's prophecy, but it's also a letter. And this is fascinating. It's amazing how often we miss this point, that Revelation is an epistle. And we know it because it tells us that as well. See, isn't it amazing? It tells us it's a revelation in its very name, apocalypsis. It tells us it's a prophecy repeatedly. And then it tells us it's a letter because it says at the outset, this is to the 7 churches that are in Asia. And it has these 7 messages. So whatever else ensues, remember, it's a message to the churches. But here's the interesting part. Before we translate that and say it's to us as the modern church, we have to understand it's written to the 7 churches of Asia Minor in the 1st century AD. And we'll get to how it's relevant to us, but we need to understand it in its context. To help you understand what I mean, let's use an example. Imagine you move into a new home. And when you get into that new home, a week later, the mail shows up, but you get a letter that's clearly addressed to the previous owner of the house, one of the previous owners. You don't even know which owner. And all it says on it is what's on behind me. Trevor, see you at the Harp on Claret Sunday. Now, let's face it, you'd be foolish, you'd be silly, you'd be quite stupid to read that and think it was addressed to you, unless your name is Trevor. Otherwise, you'd look at it and say, it's clearly not addressed to me. So for you to think that you would understand the message that wasn't intended for you is bizarre. But if you wanted to understand the message and to see if it was relevant to you, because maybe it is, then how would you go about figuring out what it meant? Well, I think the first place to start is to figure out who is Trevor. And then to figure out, when did Trevor own this house? Did he ever own this house? And was it intended, what is the harp? What does that mean? But before you get there, before you get to what the harp is and Claret Sunday, you'd probably start with who this guy is. You'd go back to the context. And let me tell you what that means. That's a text message and a message I've sent and would have sent dozens of times to friends of mine. Because Trevor is a good friend of mine. I have a couple friends named Trevor. And the Harp was the name of a pub in Port Credit in the south of Mississauga where I used to live. And I grew up with these guys in high school. And Claret Sunday refers to the Sunday of the year when the claret jug was given to the best golfer who wins the British Open. The claret jug was the trophy. So what that message means is, hey, Trevor, I'll see you at the Harp at the pub on the Sunday of the final Sunday of the British Open. Pretty simple. But you didn't know that. And the reason you didn't know that is because you don't know who Trevor is. In fact, the person writing to Trevor you don't even know, which was me. I'm the author. You don't know where or when it was written, to what context. Because you don't know any of that, you don't know what the harp is. Does that mean a literal harp? Is it a symbolic? Is it a pub? What is it? And you certainly don't know what claret is unless you have some understanding of golf. So, when we are told that Revelation is a letter, you need to understand and respect it as a letter. That it was written to first century church in a specific context. And it can be helping you, and it does speak to you and I today as well in 21st century Canada. But before we figure that out, you must spend time understanding who the churches were, what was going on. And the specificity of a letter being written to a specific people at a specific time does not diminish its relevance for you and I today at all. In fact, we're encouraged in Revelation to see it as something that is all at once for an ancient people and for you. Because John is writing it. He knows generations will read it. He doesn't know how many, probably. God certainly knew, but he didn't know. But as he writes it, he puts evidence in it. Notice he says he's writing to the 7 churches in Asia. There was way more than 7 churches in Asia. There's more than 7 churches referenced in the book of Acts in this part of the world. But what it appears John is doing is he's writing to these 7 churches that are on what they call the circular road in Turkey. And it follows a certain pattern in a circle. And perhaps these were regional churches. We don't know. But what we do know is the number 7. And remember, if you've read enough apocalyptic literature, you know the number 7 is not accidental. When it is used by an ancient writer, it is being used symbolically. And is a letter of perfection and completion. If that's the case, this letter, when we're told it's being written to 7 churches, we are being told it's thereby being written to all churches. The messages and the warnings and the encouragements in it are good for every church in every generation. And we're even told that even more directly at the end of all, I think, but one of the messages in chapters 2 and 3 to the churches. They almost all end with something like this. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Now, he's encouraging all who are reading it and hearing it to take what is being said to the churches to themselves. You and I have to hear it and understand it and keep it and trust it. And notice he says the church is what he says to the church is, meaning you're not just to take it as one, but you and I are supposed to read it and understand that the messages to all those 7 churches and all the book of Revelation are relevant to you. So it's an epistle. It is written to those people. We need to understand them and their context and their time. But then we have to ask the question of not what does that symbol mean about Donald Trump, but to say, what did that symbol mean theologically and pastorally to those people, and how do we appropriate that today? If it was meant to encourage them in the face of political tyranny, then that is what the message is for us today. Not to go stargazing, but to then first and say, what is the theological and pastoral point of the image and of the story of the letters? So that's what Revelation is. Apocalypse, prophecy, and letter. If we hold those and keep going back to them, it'll hopefully keep us safe. But let me close with a quick talk about the imagery. To understand the imagery of Revelation, most scholars, many, go to the idea of political cartoons. It's easier to understand if we look at how political cartoons use contextual and cultural images to convey deeper meaning. And sorry, I thought I heard something. You're going to disrupt my video here. But again, it's a full house. So consider if you see a political cartoon that has Justin Trudeau riding a bull through a street. Well, what does it mean? Well, there's a few ways. And sometimes people use the word literal. Well, I would just caution the word literal and think about what we mean. Because if you see Justin Trudeau on a bull in a political cartoon, there's a couple of literal ways of reading that, isn't there? Literally, it's just a man on a bull. That's all it is, literally. But the symbolic imagery of that is just as literal, because we're being told that the prime minister of this country is riding a good period of economic growth and success. That's what a bull is, a bull market, right? A bull and bear market. They're both literal translations. But which one is the point of the cartoonist? Well, the point of the cartoonist is to tell you that something about Trudeau and a positive and bullish market. That is a literal interpretation, but not a literal one in every sense. There's different ways of seeing it. So when we look at Revelation, we need to figure out those questions. He's not talking about locusts per se, when he's talking about the plagues and things that will come. What is he talking about? Is he talking about just Caesar? Is he talking about Attila the Hun? Or the Visigoths that destroyed the Roman Empire? Or the Crusades and of Charlemagne? Is he talking about Napoleon? Hitler? Or is he talking about something more deep and theological and symbolic when he's talking about destruction that's coming? So we have to answer those questions. And here is my caution, and the one piece of advice I can give you about looking at the imagery in Revelation or in any apocalypse. Our interpretations cannot be such that they render Revelation useless to previous and future generations. Let me explain what I mean. If we assume today, as many people have come to me even in the last months, will come and ask me the question is, do you think the beast, the Antichrist, is the Pope? That happens a lot. A lot of people ask me that question. Here's the problem we have with this. One, very on a more academic note, the word Antichrist doesn't show up anywhere in the book of Revelation. But that's neither here nor there. But we talk about the beast being the Pope. Let's use that as an example. Hope there's no Catholics watching. Don't be offended. It's what Protestants do sometimes. If we assume that yes, let's imagine for a moment I was to say yes, which I'm not saying. Yes, let's imagine I say that the beast, that the Antichrist is the Pope. Here's what I am effectively saying, whether you know it or not. What you're saying is that image of the beast in Revelation 13 rising out of the water is only relevant to modern, contemporary world dwellers. People who live in the time of the popes at least, if not the Pope present sense. If that's the case, then that image has no significance for the church, the early church it was written to, or subsequent churches, or anyone today or ever after who lives beyond the reign of this Pope, or unless you think it's all the popes, in which case the question is, what about those who have nothing to do with the Pope? Or what if the Pope is done away with? What about those times when there was no Pope? Does that mean this image had no relevance for the church? Well, of course not. Of course not. The point of these images is not primarily to fix a reference point in time and history. Because if it is, then what we're saying is God had no intention of giving this message to the early church, just to you today. If it's about Hitler, then that's the question. Then it has no relevance except for you in the 1930, whenever Hitler was born, 1895, up until 1945 when he commits suicide. Is that the only period Revelation was relevant in? Because that's who it speaks to? Well, of course not. And in fact, you'll fall into the same trap every time you try to fix an image and a symbol in Revelation to a historical character today. You'll find it's elusive and limiting. And you'll find that means those poor folks who are being burned at the stake for being heretics, who are being killed around the world for different reasons for their faith, you're saying those images have no comfort for you unless you understood them to be about the Pope. That's not the way images in the Bible are meant to be seen. And I'm not alone in seeing this. This is what you'll see in just about every reputable scholar. And I say reputable because, as we said earlier, there are wrong ways to read this book. And I can help point people towards resources there. So images. As we look at this imagery, let's leave it at this one very clear thing. Our interpretations must allow Revelation to have been relevant for every generation before and after us. If our interpretation is so fixed in our present context, or in any context, that it limits its use to be a comfort and a challenge to the church, we have misinterpreted it. Now, I wish I could say more, and I will say more. I'm going to be preaching about this for a while. But that ends this first video. That's a bit of an introduction. Let us look at the book of Revelation and try to remember continually that it is from God, a work that is meant to comfort and challenge us and keep it within the frameworks of apocalypse, prophecy, and epistle. If we can keep it there, I think it'll keep us at a very responsible reading of the book of Revelation. As usual, reach out to me. I know this is a controversial topic. It is a difficult book to understand and interpret, so I expect discussion. Let's keep it civil. Let's keep it respectful, and let's do what we're trying to do every day, which is try to understand God better for His glory. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.